In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about the ongoing tension between Russia and the US over Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, as you know, dear viewer, is an independent country on the borders of Russia. It became an independent country in 1992 when the Soviet Union broke up. And today there is a lot of fear and concern in the Western world that Russia's Vladimir Putin, that's the president of Russia, is going to invade Ukraine again. And you can see the Western press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the British papers are full of what the Russian president are planning to do in Ukraine. But my column in the Global Print is about comments made by the former naval chief of Germany, Vice-Admiral Kay-Achim Schonbach. He was in Delhi last week where he spoke at India's premier defense ministry think tank, the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, in which he said various things. And soon after, on Sunday morning actually, Admiral Schonbach was sacked by Germany government, which was a really, really surprising thing to do. So my column Global Print is about why Mr. Schonbach or Admiral Schonbach was sacked. And of course, this has to do with Ukraine. So, but before I talk to you about the tensions, the ongoing tensions right now between Russia and the West and why Admiral Schonbach was sacked and what India has to do with it, I'd like to make an appeal to you, dear viewers. Please do subscribe to The Print. It's very little money, just rupees 159. All you have to do is to click on the join button, become a subscriber. You will get several benefits that non-subscribers don't have. And I promise you, I assure you that it will be worth your while. So do click on the join button, pay rupees 159 and subscribe to The Print's free, fair, objective and unhyphenated journalism. Now, back to my column Global Print earlier this week, in which I take Admiral Schonbach's talk at the IDSA, which is the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis here in New Delhi, and look at the tension, the ongoing tensions between Russia and the West over Ukraine. And I'm going to first tell you a little bit about what Admiral Schonbach says. And he makes three main points. It's worthwhile for you to look at and to hear his full talk. It's on the IDSA website, so you can just click on that and hear Admiral Schonbach in first person. So Admiral Schonbach makes 3 points in his IDSA lecture. The first is that the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, wants the respect of the world and he should be given it. And he says, and let me quote what he says. He says, what does Russia really want? Is Russia really interested in having a small, tiny strip of Ukraine's soil to integrate into their country? I think Putin is putting pressure because he knows he can do it. He knows he can split the European Union. But what he really wants is respect. And my God, giving someone respect is low cost, even no cost. Those are Admiral Schonbach's words, which is really quite interesting because if you look at it, he is or was until Sunday morning the head of Germany's Navy, a very powerful job, a very powerful man. You don't just rise to the head of the Navy or of a Western European country, which basically means that you're obviously very much part of not just what the government thinks, but the ideological sort of underpinning of these countries. And despite that, he was sacked. Now, just to give you a little bit of the context, when he made his remarks last Friday in Delhi, the Secretary of State of the US, which is Antony Blinken, and his Russian counterpart, the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, were in talks in Geneva. Just before that, the US President Joe Biden had talked about Ukraine, and he's been saying a lot of things about Ukraine these last few days. But so Schonbach makes his comments just a few hours after Blinken and Lavrov have met in Geneva. Since then, of course, a lot of water has flowed under the various bridges in the various European cities, whether it's the Moscow or elsewhere. And what Joe Biden has said earlier was That first he says that, the US will forgive a minor incursion. And then when a lot of world leaders and even the world press were very critical about what he said, he quickly sort of backtracked and said, no, that's not what I meant. And he says that Russia will face severe sanctions if Putin even thinks of invading the Ukraine. Of course, Schonbach is not Joe Biden, but he's not politically elected. He has risen to the top of the German Navy, of course, unfortunately, before he was sacked. So the context in which he makes these remarks in Delhi at the IDSA is what I've just told you about. So there is this build-up of tension between the two sides, between Russia and the Western coalition. And Schonbach then goes ahead and makes these public comments. Very, very undiplomatic, but I suppose you can't really fault a military man for speaking his mind. So to go back to the 3 points that Schonbach is making, and the first is that Putin is not really interested in its tiny sliver of Ukrainian territory. What he's really after is respect, the respect to be treated as an equal by the coalition of the West. Now, again, let me give you some context and background, dear viewer. The first is that when Putin becomes president in 2000, which is 22 long years ago, one of the first things he does is that he tells NATO that why don't you invite Russia to become a member of NATO? Now, that's anathema in a sense, because NATO is a pre-Cold War organization, and one of the enemies of NATO, if you like, was the former Soviet Union. But Putin's argument is that the Soviet Union is dead, that this is a new world order at any rate, and why can't the new Russia and NATO be friends? But of course, for the last 22 years, there has been no reply at all from NATO. So now, Schonbach is saying Putin is seeking the respect of the rest of the world, especially of the West, and he's also talking about how in the new Russia, if you look at how in the last 22 years since Putin first became president, Russia has been able to establish itself as a much more preeminent power than it was when the Soviet Union broke up. And we know when the Soviet Union broke up that Russia really collapsed into and became a very, very poor country, economically poor. Of course, it still had a lot of nuclear weapons, but apart from that, there wasn't very much else. So in these last 22 years, Russia has been able to reassert its presence in the world community. Most recently, we saw in Kazakhstan when there were riots in Almaty, and the Kazakh government requested the Russian president to send Russian troops, which he did with some alacrity, of course, quelled the riots, and then they came back. So that was a big feather in Putin's cap. The second point that Schonbach is making is that the Crimean Peninsula, which the Russians took in 2014, is never coming back, and that the rest of the world better get used to that idea. Now, again, this was quite startling, quite alarming to the Western coalition, especially when, like I said, Blinken was having talks with Lavrov. Now, since 2014, when Putin's grab of Crimea has taken place, the tension between Russia and the West has only gone up. But as Schonbach is saying, that look at the Russian elite, and he's not just talking about Putin. The Russian elite believes that that Russia is a powerful country. It is here to stay. It is here to offer an alternative view of the world, if you like, and it must be considered a great power by the rest of the world. Now, the reason for the Crimea grab in 2014, or one of the reasons for this, was, of course, that you have the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol that's located in Crimea. And part of the Black Sea Fleet, you have nuclear-capable cruisers and submarines. Of course, the warheads are kept somewhere else in storage and somewhere else in Russia. They're not there on the Black Sea Fleet itself. But what Schonbach is indicating is that the Russians are not giving Crimea back, and that the sooner that the West gets used to that idea, the better it is for everybody. The third very interesting point that Schonbach is trying to make is, and it's really a sort of advice, if you like, to his own coalition, which is that who is the greater enemy? And his answer is that Russia is not the greater enemy. The greater enemy is China. So what he's trying to do is to concentrate the West's mind and saying that you have to focus your energies on what China is doing. Now, in the rest of his talk at the IDSA, and like I said, I advise you to hear the whole talk. It's about an hour long. He talks about how the former German Chancellor, very popular woman, Angela Merkel, made several trips to China. And one of the reasons she came in the way of an American sort of containment of China or a US-led containment of China is because she wanted, and she knew that the German economy was in many ways hugely dependent on the Chinese, for example, German cars, which are very popular in China. So to keep Germany's GDP up, she knew that China had to be an important and had to remain an important trading partner. But what Schonbach is now saying is that things have changed in Germany. There is a new government, which is perhaps more human rights friendly. So it will not look at China in the same way that Angela Merkel did. And that is his advice to the Western world as well, which is concentrate your energies, focus your mind. China is the enemy, not Russia. Now, what does all this mean for India? Should India take a position? Does India have a position at all? Does it have any skin in the game? Now, you would argue that Russia is a very close partner of India's, has been a very close partner. And we saw when President Putin came to Delhi in early December, he and Prime Minister Modi had a very heart-to-heart and a very warm conversation between them. And from all accounts, it went off. The visit was very, very good. But Ukraine is quite an interesting story in the New Delhi foreign policy establishment. And let me say that about a year ago, which is in December 2020, there was a resolution that was put forward by Ukraine at the United Nations, which basically talked about human rights violations conducted by Russia in Ukraine. And what was really interesting was that India voted against that Ukrainian resolution, which means it voted alongside Russia. It did not abstain, mind you, dear viewer. It voted against the resolution. And even in 2014, when the Manmohan Singh government was still around, and then National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon, and this is in the wake of Putin's Crimea grab, in reaction to which Mr. Menon said that Russia had legitimate interests in the Crimea. Now make that of what you wish, which is that across the foreign policy establishment, whether it's the Manmohan Singh government or the Congress government or the BJP government, India believes that what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, at least so far it believes that, is what the Russians are doing so far in Ukraine is fine. Now remember that the US is also a very, very close friend, a strategic partner of India. And perhaps you could argue that India is walking a very fine line, maintaining this very fine balance between its interests and its partnership with its old friend, the Russians, and with the US. But we will follow this story, of course, over the next few days. But just to bring to you Vice-Admiral, the former naval chief of Germany, Kay-Achim Schonbach, and his comments at the IDSA, which in a sense very succinctly encapsulates this ongoing tension between Russia and the US over Ukraine. Thank you so much for watching this video, dear viewer. I hope you will also read my column in the Global Print on the Print's website, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for watching.